Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join our session. I hope it's one of the more interesting and compelling ones that you will be experiencing today. Today, we are going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is data warehouses and data architectures, and really everything that's kind of new and changing and different in this increasingly vibrant and important and strategic aspect of information technology. I will be your moderator for the next 15 minutes or so. My name is Adam Gross. I am an investor and board member, but previously worked at companies like Heroku and Salesforce and Dropbox, and a lot of experience building, operating, and using these kinds of systems as well, which maybe I'll pepper into the discussion. With that, maybe we'll take a minute to introduce our distinguished guests, and perhaps we can start with you, Ben.
Thank you, Adam. Absolute pleasure to be here. My name is Ben Goffredson. I've been with Snowflake for almost 7 years now. So not only is Snowflake in that time really gone from bootstrap startup to the enterprise it is today, but I've noticed a ton of major transformations in that same period. So Adam, like you, love discussing this topic and impressed by the staff we have to actually discuss it today. So honored to be here.
Great. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Sumit, maybe we can go to you next.
Hey, this is Soumidip. I'm the founder and CEO of RudderStack. Really excited to be here in this panel with Snowflake and Tonal. Like RudderStack, at a very high level, is building the next generation customer data platform for a data warehouse first world. So this topic is very close to my heart. Quick background: I've been an entrepreneur, like sold my previous company to 8x8, and that's like some of the pain points in that journey like prompted us to start RudderStack. And I have like a PhD in data, so always worked in data all my life, but data applied to marketing in the last couple of years. But again, humbled and excited to be here.
Great, thanks for joining us. And last but certainly not least, maybe Jamila, you can introduce yourself. And I think, Jamila, you might be muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you for introducing me, Adam. Super happy to be on the panel here. And yeah, as mentioned, I'm Jamila, a Director of Marketing Analytics at Tonal. In terms of, my background, have been in data for most of my career. Started out kind of, with more enterprise level retail, consulting side, and now more on the tech and, startup kind of side. For those of you who may not be familiar with Tonal, a super cool product. It is essentially a smart home gym that essentially you can mount on your wall like a TV. It has 200 pounds of digital weight behind it, and it's really adaptive. So there's a lot of machine learning and AI behind the scenes where in the middle of a workout, it'll adjust your weight for you. It'll count for you. It will recommend content for you. So super exciting product. So I've been around here for about 9 months, and I'm really focusing on the analytics side of Tonal, but more in the marketing space. So super, super pumped to be here. And yeah, can't wait to chat more about this topic.
Great, thank you. So it is an exciting time in the data infrastructure space. It's an exciting time for vendors, for customers, for people working in it. I think that's reflected in the energy we see in kind of new companies, in new applications. But it might not be kind of clear to everybody kind of what's different. I think many of us have used and worked with databases and data warehouses for a long time. I think why we're here today is to talk about all the things that are enabled with this kind of new generation of products that's emerging and kind of real fundamental changes in how databases and data warehousing works. Ben, you're an old hand at Snowflake, probably the pioneer in this new model. Maybe we can start with you and just talk a little bit about what's changed from a kind of technology point of view. What's different now than the previous generation that's kind of enabling all this kind of new stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think the first one that's obvious at this point, but it wasn't obvious in 2014, 2015, is the impact of unlimited capacity coming from the major clouds, and what that would turn companies and startups that weren't very data driven, and then what it would turn them into just by leveraging that public cloud capability. Like I've countless stories in my time at Snowflake where we watched a company go from 10 gigabytes to 100 terabytes and they didn't even really think twice about it. It just kind of happened organically over the course of 9 to 12 months. And all of a sudden they're a data-driven company with what 2 years ago would have been, an absurdly large data environment. And that just repeated many times over. So I'd say what the public cloud's enabled is a big driver. I think simplified tool sets is a big driver. I remember going to Hadoop conferences in 2014 and 2015, and it was pretty overwhelming, the languages you needed to know to get by at that thing. And today it's kind of been unified across tool sets that are a little bit easier to understand and kind of lowers the barrier to entry for using tools like Snowflake and other data platforms like it. And I think the third point would be new data types have really come about, right? Like it's not the same super structured data sets of the past that you can analyze. There's a lot of semi-structured and a lot of unstructured data that companies can start leveraging that was really difficult to, if not impossible, before.
So it seems one of the kind of foundational differences between this kind of new era and the previous one is the kinds of databases and data warehouses we're talking about now are cloud only. I can't, and you tell me if I've got this right, I can't install Snowflake on-prem. I can only get it on a public cloud. And by virtue of that, I'm able to take advantage of kind of the very different infrastructure and economies of scale, and obviously kind of flexible consumption that's implicit in those models. And is that accurate? And is that kind of fair to say that the foundation of this kind of new model is it's going to be cloud only?
100%. And again, going back to early days of Snowflake, that was a contentious point. And I think in 2021, it's not as contentious of a point. We had a lot of big banks and institutions that were super hesitant to consider anything on the cloud. And they basically said, come back to us when you guys have an on-premise solution. And over the past 6-7 years, it's kind of gone the reverse trend where they're now finally getting comfortable with cloud adoption. So yeah, I mean, that's the future, and that's no negotiation point is how I'd see it. But I'd be curious to hear how the rest of the panel viewed that point as well.
Maybe that's a good opportunity to go to you, Jamila. And as somebody, I worked at Salesforce a long time, at Dropbox, Heroku, all cloud-only companies. I'm familiar with the challenges of kind of enterprise adoption of cloud. You've had a kind of long history of working with different environments. How have the organizations you've been at been thinking about this kind of cloud-only approach and some of the kind of security and governance questions that come with that?
Yeah, I can definitely tell you it differs based off of industry for sure. So if I kind of rewind back 10 plus years ago, it was very transactional. You would store data based on transactions. You wouldn't necessarily look at customer attributes or store too much information. You'd kind of have the bare minimum of what you need, and it would primarily be financial reporting, annual statements, things like that. You wouldn't really be seeing marketing or supply chain teams using data as much as they could. Today, there's a lot more, I think, smart decision making that goes behind it. Before they maybe didn't look too much into, buying patterns at a daily or hourly or even like store level. It was very aggregate. You buy in bulk, even TV, and when you're bidding programmatically for advertisements. Before it was very much like once a year, once a quarter. You really plan ahead of time. You buy in bulk, and it's very manual. You're making deals with people. Now it's all about systems and algorithms, and everything is happening behind the scenes. Even like with website data, that is a completely like new form of data, and the volume is crazy. There's a ton of data coming in real time, really quickly. And so this is a big change I've seen is, when I started out, it was, primarily financial data. You're spending time on a spreadsheet, you're downloading it from some on-prem, database. It could take, days to, get what you need, massaging the data. And then if you have to do it again, it's a manual process. Now it's kind of automated where, you can kind of set up event streams, using tools like RudderStack, for example. Dump them into a tool like Snowflake where you can then, leverage other tools on top of it for data modeling. I know dbt, is one of a fairly popular one, leveraging tools like Airflow, for example, as well. And you can kind of have repeatable processes sending data to platforms, and now decisions are being made with algorithms in real time. And so this is, I'd say, like probably one of the biggest shifts that I've seen, where now you can just do so much more in so much less time, and the velocity and volume of data has really exploded. Now, to speak to the industries, I've worked in the retail side and on the telco side, and I can definitely say, on the telco side, there is a lot more regulatory requirements. And so, for them, the transition phase was very, traditional on-prem. Then they did the whole, as Ben mentioned, Hadoop, data lake in-house, still on-prem, but it was painful. It's still very slow, still really clunky. And then now, in the same boat where it's, okay, we want to move to the cloud, let's POC it. Let's use digital data to try it out, because digital data is, on-prem doesn't work for that. You need something faster and something better. And so we kind of test it out, but still getting, the enterprise level contracts and the approvals and privacy and legal, like all of that just takes years to kind of figure out. And so that's still a barrier, I think. It's definitely becoming less of a barrier as we're seeing, a lot more governments even starting to, move on to cloud. So I think there's definitely a lot of shift happening for sure.
That's great, and a good segue maybe to talk a little bit about, again, kind of what's enabling this transition from kind of a product and technology point of view. Maybe I'll ask you to chime in here, Sumita. Jamila mentioned Hadoop. Hadoop was kind of the last great hope for transforming all the ways we were going to use data. That's, I think, different than this new generation of tools like Snowflake and other cloud data warehouses. What happened there? Is Hadoop in the picture? Is this something that's different? And if so, kind of why now? What's different versus folks who might have been kind of sold Hadoop over the past decade?
Yeah, I think there are two main things in my mind, right? Number one is Hadoop never took Hadoop is a technology, right? It's like some MapReduce or some kind of a storage technology. So and some of that is still driving the cloud providers, not exactly maybe, but the S3s of the world and so on, are kind of built over the same technology. It was, I think, the main challenge was the deployment model. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with Hadoop, but how people were deploying Hadoop, that you set up a server in your on-prem data center and you manage that and so on. So it was kind of painful to do that compared to let's say that just store all your data in AWS and the AWS takes care of everything, right? So that's kind of one thing. And the other big challenge was the compute part of it, right? I mean, the storage is one part, but compute itself, how do you scale up, scale down? I mean, you don't need a farm of machines you're doing some ML computation. It runs only for a couple of hours a week or a day, right? I mean, do you provision your compute for the entire peak capacity? Again, that was a big challenge in the on-prem world. It kind of goes away in the cloud. So I think it was less about the technology and more about the deployment model, how people were using Hadoop versus what cloud enabled. And it was kind of written on the door.
In the Hadoop model, I guess it kind of depends on the deployment, but typically you're kind of statically provisioning a whole bunch of machines that you got to keep around the whole time, as opposed to kind of this next generation, sometimes called serverless, meaning you only are consuming compute as you need it to run queries, and of course then it's just going to be a whole lot more efficient and cost effective than kind of keeping the infrastructure hot and ready the entire time.
Yeah, and in fact, Snowflake kind of took it to the extreme where you can literally provision compute, run a SQL query, and bring it down, right? As opposed to provisioning a data warehouse. So that kind of flexibility really enables use cases that you could not do cost effectively in the previous world. If I have a very costly query, I can just provision the biggest instance on Snowflake and just pay for the minute it runs, which was absolutely not possible.
You mentioned, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there's a few interesting applications of that elasticity, and especially for marketing analytics. And one of them is the separation of compute and storage. You don't have to be concerned with limiting how much storage you're actually keeping in your data platform, and so you can act on more time-sensitive data sets and not worry about cycling anything in and out. And then, like Somideb touched on, the elasticity on compute really can help on more complex workloads, spin up to an environment that is much larger than you typically need for X amount of time to get that job done. And that's a common use case in the CDP marketing landscape, at least that we see.
And one of the interesting things you mentioned as well there, which is a difference from kind of the previous Hadoop generation, is tools like Snowflake are SQL native. That I don't need to, I'm not writing a MapReduce job in some esoteric language. And yes, there were tools in Hadoop that allow you kind of translate that, but this is kind of a SQL first, SQL only model, which has the benefit that most organizations and most data people kind of already understand how to use those, which brings kind of interesting question, and maybe go back to you, Jamila, on this. Kind of curious, both you're talking about the kind of business implications of this, right? Moving from just capturing kind of very coarse-grained transactional data to having kind of a much richer, broader, deeper, real-time set of data for an organization. I'm curious how that impacted the organization, one, technically, in terms of, how do you, as an organization, what have you seen, how have they evolved in order to be able to take advantage of this? Because that's a pretty non-trivial shift. And then even more importantly, from a business point of view, being able to adapt to leverage these new models, all this new data is an even bigger shift. So kind of curious for your thoughts on both of those.
Yeah, for sure. I think I can kind of maybe speak to this from an organizational structure standpoint. So I remember, back in the day when it was purely transactional, IT owned everything. Now you look at it, IT doesn't own everything. Typically what you'll notice is that different teams have different use cases. They have different speeds at which they require different things. And so there are more DevOps teams. There are more, software engineering, productivity engineering teams that support like real life products where, you need to have uptimes and, kind of modifications and different APIs to connect to enable services to happen. And then you also notice now that there's data engineering teams, there's data science teams. These teams didn't exist back in the day. And I think this is probably, the result of the proliferation. We have so many different new data sources and a new kind of hybrid skill set is needed. And so that's kind of one of, I think, the biggest things I've seen from an organizational standpoint in terms of what's changed. The use cases from a business standpoint have also changed. I know historically there's typically, you see a lot of friction between IT teams, and business teams. The business wants something, IT says, oh, we'll get back to you, a long time passes and then you kind of, you're behind competition now. And so I think from a business standpoint, being able to at least POC different things and get things up and off the ground running quickly is why they started developing these, data science and data engineering and DevOps teams, because this unblocks people, but you still have a little bit of governance where, you do have different teams playing in different areas, but it allows you to be more flexible. And so that's one thing, if you want to get a quick example would be, you want to get a model up for people that are on your website and you want to be able to score people on your website based on certain metrics to understand if they're likely or not to do certain actions. This, you need to have a web analytics team to kind of track stuff on the website. You need to have a data team to kind of capture that data and store that data. You need to have an engineering team to kind of massage that data and kind of, put it into a place where you can actually access it. And this is kind of where the data warehouse comes in, but it's at the center of it all, right? Once it's in the data warehouse, then there's more work needed because you need to then manipulate the data. You might need a combination of SQL, maybe Python too, right? And then you got to send that score somewhere else in real time and enable it back in the API backend service so that, you can actually then introduce content and, flip things around based on what people see when they come to your website, for example. And so this is a really huge change, I think, that wasn't really there before.
There's a real tension there between, kind of the old centralization IT model, which I think probably most of us have seen and experienced the limits of, with a desire to kind of push that out to the different business units and kind of business owners, and kind of maybe more decentralize that. But then, of course, you run into all the problems of repeating and technologies. You have all this heterogeneity, which can be hard to manage. What guidance would you give folks in terms of how to think about creating a structure, create an organization in terms of ownership to enable these kinds of next generation applications to be able to take advantage of all this stuff and data inside of organizations?
So yeah, typically what I've seen is, marketing teams might say, hey, we want to try something out. And, you work with legal, you work with privacy to get all of the contracts signed. And I've actually seen sometimes that, marketing teams or product teams, typically they introduce new tools and they start leveraging those tools. And then at a point, once it becomes big enough and it's proven itself out, then you kind of work with IT to say like, okay, look, we now need to integrate this into kind of our workhorse. And it's now a priority because they can kind of see the impact that it's having on the business. That's what I've seen in my experience. I mean, it might be slightly different. So curious to hear, Ben, like anything on your end as well.
Yeah, I think Jamila, you had a point earlier, and you said, then it goes to the warehouse for analysis, right? And that's if you're lucky. That's if the data is not siloed into various SaaS applications. And our CIO wrote an interesting internal blog about this. But just because a SaaS application is on the cloud doesn't mean it's unified on your cloud ecosystem and your cloud platform. And what we see a lot, and I think what RudderStack actually comes into the fray in, is when data sets get completely siloed onto different SaaS applications, any work that's done on that single SaaS application is going to be only unique to that SaaS application. So ultimately what you need is a horizontal view across your SaaS apps and not a vertical view that's dependent on one new application that you bring in to solve one exact use case or workload. And so having some single source of truth, which is made a lot easier with a tool like RudderStack, makes the communication between the data teams and between the company a lot more seamless. And that's something that we're, especially in the last 5-6 years, having to retroactively solve for. And it's something that a smart team should be pretty forward thinking about.
Yeah, just to double down on what Ben, you're saying, I mean, we have seen use cases like churn prediction. You're trying to predict which are the customers who are going to churn, and that requires bringing first-party product usage data coming from your apps and so on, but also third-party, data locked into your ticketing system like Zendesk or your CRM application, right? And then you need to unify all of that data to build these kind of applications. And you cannot do it in Zendesk or any other tool in isolation. You have to bring it into a data warehouse to build the next generation of applications. So yeah, I mean, and then after you have that score, you have to push it back into some kind of a tool where you can take the action on top of that data, right? Whether it's something like a customer management tool or like Salesforce where you're tracking your customers. So these kind of new gen architectures require the warehouse to be at the center of it. Although, Adam, back to your point around SQL, I think the jury is still out. Is SQL powerful enough to enable all these applications? I know you're smiling; it's your favorite topic, but yeah, I mean, what will SQL drive? What will Spark Python drive? I think Snowflake at some point will support good support for Spark and so on. So yeah, it's still out in. I think DBT has kind of layered taken SQL ahead in terms of adding programmatic abstractions, but then again, is it enough to build some of these complex applications? And we kind of see that.
I'm pro. I even throw some Python in there personally myself occasionally. I think it's more about making simple things simple and the hard things possible. And I think the Hadoop model probably suffered from making some of the simple things unnecessarily hard. So
for sure.
And I think it's also refreshing with tools like RudderStack and Snowflake and DBT to see kind of democratization of the skills and technology, making much more available, make the better attention to the experience, and ultimately kind of make it easier for people to engage in this stuff. So thank you for allowing me that editorial opportunity. I'll shift it back to maybe something that people actually care about. Ben mentioned CDPs. Sumedad, you're talking about kind of the operational data warehouse, which is kind of this idea of a new model that's enabled by bringing in data from all the places, but not just kind of traditionally thinking about that as a place to run reports or do analytics, but actually do business relevant computation, which is then pushed back out to other systems. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how RudderStack's approach is different than some of the other kind of approaches in the broader kind of CDP space that's existed for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be a plug for RudderStack, but at a very high level, we are kind of building the CDP around this data warehouse at the center, right? A lot of the other CDP vendors are purely SaaS applications selling to the marketing teams. The idea that you send everything to them and they will give you the tooling required to let's say create audiences and predictive audiences and so on, and then you can activate that data. But you never get access to the raw data. So for example, what you cannot do is connect, let's say, Tableau or Looker and build charts on top of that. or like build more advanced ML use cases, or even like marketing attribution use cases, right? So that's kind of the traditional CDP approach. What we are doing is like saying that you should have complete control over the data in your data warehouse so that you can enable these kind of applications. At the same time, you need to do some basic things, right? You have to do identity stitching. You cannot just dump the raw data and leave everything to the customer to like kind of figure that out. So you need to do some basic hygiene, clean up, data governance, data quality, all the stuff on the data, but like enable these kind of use cases on top of your data warehouse.
Jamila, is this idea of kind of the operational data warehouse, and you heard Ben talk about it as well, is this kind of an explicit strategy inside of organizations you've worked in, or is this more like, it's kind of happening in the background and kind of we're getting led there eventually?
No, it's a key pillar. We definitely, I think, as organizations want to own our data. We don't want to have third-party vendors own our data. So that's kind of a key piece of it. So working with a vendor like RudderStack definitely has that benefit. The other part of it is identity stitching can sometimes be a black box. You don't know how vendors are doing it. And you don't know if they're doing it right. And so by being able to have your own data, you're able to kind of validate. And ideally, you have the team, in place, the structure in place to be able to do this. Because if you're, maybe a company that doesn't have someone who has the skills to do identity stitching, then that definitely can be a roadblock. And this is where SaaS vendors may be helpful. But I think in all of my experiences, this is kind of something you kind of want to do in-house. You want to have that, each company, if you think about it, has their own way and their own identity graph, right? Like you might have, your own authentication service on your own site that you could then leverage to build your identity graph and your identity profiles. And you don't know if these vendors are, using that the same way. So it's definitely, I think, a key thing. And then on top of it, it enables so many use cases because now you can pump the data into Looker or Tableau or whatever visualization tool you want to leverage, right? You can actually splice and dice the data. You can do customer segmentation. You can build brand new KPIs that are not really like standard KPIs that you get from, like, let's say, Google Analytics, right? You can build your own type of KPIs, own type of audiences. And then, of course, the challenge always is, how do you govern it, and how do you then send that data back to the systems that need the feedback? And so this is also where, this is where the CDP really comes in, right? Because you don't need to have a full-out engineer who's rebuilding things, reinventing the wheel all the time when you just want to send something somewhere else. And so this is where, RudderStack, they've done all the groundwork. They've, built the connections. So, Facebook, for example, right? And so now we can just kind of plug and play, leverage those connections, rinse and repeat for all of the other vendors that we work with. But we can send from our central data warehouse a common definition and deploy across multiple different channels. And the other challenge as well is different systems have different requirements and different ways that they need the data. And so this is also where I think, you need to have some kind of tool to help you do that. Otherwise, it gets too difficult to maintain. And so that's also where I see CDPs really fitting in is, they've kind of figured out all of that stuff. And so they've productized that. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. But that's kind of my opinion.
Yeah. You mentioned identity stitching, which is obviously, a super important problem. Every digital business is multi-channel. Being able to understand, how a given customer is interacting with my app versus my exercise equipment versus my website versus whatever the case might be. I think that's probably a universal problem. I guess I would be a little nervous about any given organization's ability to take on a problem like that and say, you've asserted this is something you think organizations grow themselves. Is your guidance to folks, hey, come on in, the water's not that bad, or is there things you kind of need to be ready to take on or own when you approach a problem like that versus handing it off to a vendor?
I think it depends on the maturity of the company. So, if you're, let's say, ground zero startup and you're building out your customer journey, you're building out your workflows, you got to think about what pieces of information can I use at each step to stitch together the user journey. What are those touch points, right? And if you can identify what those touch points are, then yeah, you might be in a better position. You can connect that to, a quick SaaS vendor. And, as long as you're able to connect those pieces and have those pieces there, the vendor can do some stitching for you. But if you're, a much larger enterprise, and you have, like, I can give you a quick example in my past where, I've worked at a huge company. They're, really big loyalty program, lots of different lines of businesses, and single customer unique identifier across all of it, right? it would probably make sense for them to build their own in-house, because for them, the privacy implications, number one, of giving that data to a vendor to do it is like that could result in co-op, right? Where vendors like, I'm gonna throw Adobe out there, but Adobe has a co-op program where you can leverage them, do identity stitching using their products, but then at the end of the day, who owns that data, right? And that you could opt in to share that data with other vendors. Now, there's pros and cons. It depends on if you're a bank, you might not want to share that data to enrich your customer profiles, with maybe other data. But if you're not a bank, maybe you don't have as many regulations. You might be like, hey, this is a selling feature for me. I'm going to go in and that might be something that would be beneficial for them to help with identity stitching. But I think it depends on the business, right? If you don't have authentication and if you don't have the necessary means in place to stitch your own customers, then you can't do it yourself. It's deterministically and probabilistically, like it's a very, very tricky slope, right, to go down. And so it really depends, I think, on the company. So sorry, I'm not going to be able to give you an explicit answer, but I think it's a circumstantial, depending on where you are, what would be sufficient.
It's a really important issue, and it's a little bit of the kind of the holy grail of some of these bigger data marketing systems. So I think it's helpful to point out. Maybe we'll shift gears a little bit in some of our remaining time. We've talked a lot about kind of the infrastructure and the organizational issues. Maybe we can just talk about some of the cool stuff. And I'll start again with you, Jamila. Maybe it doesn't have to be the most impactful thing, but just something maybe cool or interesting that you've seen built or one of your organizations has worked on as a result of taking advantage of these new stacks.
Yeah, I can definitely say like personalization is definitely a key thing. And so when you take a look at what content are people viewing on the website, what products are people viewing on the website, as well as apps, throughout the entire space, being able to essentially put groups of customers into different segments and then layer on, different propensity model scores that you have, and then figure out what you recommend to them. And, getting those scores in real time, added to the data layer of the website, and then you're able to actually connect your content management system with what you see in the back end from the data science work. And I think connecting those two, that's super cool, right? And it's very hard to do. It's not easy to do by any means. You think it's something simple, but really it's not. And so I feel like that's probably an example I can share.
That does sound pretty cool. I'll be curious at some point to learn more about that. Ben, maybe kind of similar question to you. You mentioned CDP, marketing, operational data warehouse, kind of common use cases for Snowflake. Any just interesting examples of how you've seen this stuff kind of ultimately put to use and the impact it's had?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about Snowflake is it just kind of crosses over every industry you can imagine. I think the trend that is really exciting right now, it's maybe a little specific to us, is the ability to share data sets between two different Snowflake users. And so you can think about how that might play out in a partnership between a vendor and their customer. It just kind of really reduces the friction if you're able to share a live queryable data set from the vendor's account to the customer's account without having to move it. And where I've seen it really make an impact and be interesting on my side is the reduced friction they have on their sales cycles. So instead of asking for them like a siloed, isolated SaaS application would have to, or like an old school CDP where they'd say, hey, you need to trust us, you need to send us this data set, we'll put it on our system, and then we'll provide it back to you. Instead, they can just share the data set that's already living and existing in their Snowflake account just by giving credentialed access. So that shift has made things a lot easier, and it's cool to see it play out when a customer of Snowflake is able to win a deal for themselves faster because of it.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and maybe another topic as well to explore later. And Sumit, I'll ask you the kind of same question. Favorite customer examples or kind of cool apps or use cases you've seen being built with putting together all this data and hard work?
Yeah, personalization is definitely one of that. One other thing I'd point out is like one of our customers built a churn model, again, using the data that is being collected through RudderStack. And like they're a mobile game, and they're trying to predict like which are the customers who are likely to churn. And like if somebody's churning, they can give them free coupons and bring them back in the app. And like using the simple model they built, they could increase their revenue by 10%. Like this whole thing took some effort in terms of like feature engineering, but like end to end, this was put together within a week, and that drove up the revenue by 10%. Right? So these kind of use cases are like enabled by like both tools like RudderStack, but also like the cloud data warehouses like Snowflake and democratization of these models also. Right? I mean, like building, and there's a lot of innovation that we didn't talk about as like has happened in the ML space itself, which kind of makes these models very easy to develop, deploy, run, and so on.
I'll give you a chance to kind of chime in there. What kinds of tools are you seeing people typically use on the ML side in conjunction with these architectures? If there was a place for an organization to start, would you have a recommendation?
Yeah, so there are two broad approaches, right? I mean, some of the data warehouses have native support for like ML these days, so you can like train a model just with SQL. So that's kind of one set of particularly like smaller startups do that first, and then like as the company scales, it's usually like the spot for, right? You dump the data into some kind of a data lake, whether like Databricks or whether it's like S3 and so on, and then like build your Spark model. So I guess like it's both. Like smaller companies would start with a warehouse, bigger ones are in the S3 world. I think the holy grail would be when you could like really run Spark very easily on a cloud data warehouse and so on. So that's the world I'm waiting for.
Adam, I'd be remiss if I didn't add to the cool use cases Tonal. I mean, next generation home gym built on the wall. I don't think you can get a cooler use case than that. So
yeah.
I had to throw that in there.
Oh no, I mean I'm doing this because I'm hoping to kind of finagle one somehow. I think like a lot of us, we got addicted to our internet connected fitness equipment. So you don't need to sell me twice on that. We're getting a little close towards the end of the session here. I'll quickly check to see if there's any questions people in the audience have, and I'm happy to put any of our guests on the hot seat, so we can make it fun and controversial too. And if not, I'll just do my best to make that happen. So, question, and I'll open it up to everybody. When you think about kind of moving towards this model, this operational data warehouse model, and maybe you're moving from kind of traditional siloed stuff, how should a company think about scoping the time and resources? And maybe I'll start with you, Ben, on that one.
Yeah, I think it depends how. I guess it depends where the stage of the company's at, right? So if they have a ton of ingrained processes and logic that's built out over years, and even cloud tools are worse off on-premise tools, it's going to be a more complex shift. Now, if the tool is already, or if the company is already live on the cloud with cloud native apps and not living with a ton of tech debt, the shift can be incredibly simple. So it really depends on the complexity built out on the existing systems. And for newer companies, obviously that's going to err on the side of less complex migrations.
Jamila, any advice on kind of the starting out phases and how to think about scoping or mistakes to avoid?
Yeah, I'd say outsource what isn't going to be your core competency when you're building things out. Just one example I've seen a few times is for your ETL process, a company might really try to just build that on their own, the connector from some data source to their warehouse. And the amount of blood, sweat, and tears that goes into trying to make that thing work and run consistently, every time at least I've seen it has outweighed what the potential cost of bringing in a vendor would have been. So make those smart trade-offs up front and think about what the initial investment's going to reap for you in the long term versus just trying to solve things on your own up front.
Great. Sumedad, I got one for you. We have these new data warehouses. We have tools to load data into them. We have great new things we can do with the data. But increasingly, as we kind of want to use this data more and more in our applications, latency becomes a problem in terms of kind of the whole system. How long does it take data to go from the source system, get loaded into the data warehouse? What are you seeing? What do you recommend? What do you think about kind of getting towards real time in some of these flows, and how are you thinking about that at RudderStack?
Yeah, I think so. Like, firstly, I have like a few points that people talk a lot about real time. Like, it's a cool thing to talk about, but there are very few use cases which really need like real time data. Maybe personalization is one of that, but so that's kind of one. The other thing is, like, I mean, if you look at data warehouses, like this, I mean, it's actually pretty. You cannot get to like second level real time, but otherwise you can go to like pretty real time, at least at a minute level of like loading data into Snowflake and like and doing something with that data and then activating that data back. Right? So we have customers doing that around like on top of Snowflake. So I think like, again, if you really need millisecond level real time, then you have to like put like a separate stack around some kind of an in-memory key value store or something. But for the majority of the use cases, like Snowflake is like perfect, right? With their streaming load and so on.
I think you're probably being generous in imagining what people's experiences are in terms of latency. I have worked at some very large, sophisticated tech companies where we had 30-day latencies on some of our data. So kind of what I'm hearing is it's realistic to get to a minute, but it's not realistic with these architectures. It's probably not realistic to get below that kind of resolution. You're probably going to need to look at a different stack, different technology. And of course, you know, you can probably think about which applications fall into which bucket.
Exactly.
As they say, all consistency is eventual anyway. So, you know, even in real time. Okay, we have a couple more questions. If all of your data, we're thinking about kind of combining all the data into one data warehouse, how do you think about kind of point solutions? There are a lot of kind of analytical tools that are kind of point solutions that in some ways require their own data. How do those into this picture? Do they go away? Do they complement, work better with this architecture? Assuming that I know you've had some experience here too, so I'll throw that one to you.
Yeah, I think like eventually, like there's point solutions. Let's say you take Google Analytics, right? I mean, like why would you have to like send data to Google Analytics to generate those reports? Like your data you're already dumping that data into Snowflake, and there should be like a tool like that which just runs on top of Snowflake and gets you the same set of reports and a lot more flexibility around being like customize those reports and like run SQL on top, right? So unfortunately, the world is not there yet, but it is going there. I mean, your data will be centralized in cloud data warehouses, and like the point solutions will be like tools on top of that. You still need some engagement tools. So, for example, if you have to send an email or send a push notification and so on, you'll still need like a tool to go and execute that. But then that should be like just a transactional thing which executes that thing. Your center source of truth should be data stored in Snowflake or a cloud data warehouse.
Yeah, no, that's that. You want the point solution to integrate really nicely and run on top of the warehouse and leverage the warehouse for storage and for compute. And it comes back to the concept of avoiding data silos wherever you can. And if you're having to send your data out, it's creating a silo, right? And wherever you're sending it is unlikely to have the same performance as the warehouse you're shipping it out of. So keep that in mind.
Yeah. Jamila, I'll ask you, you know, we've been talking a little about kind of ML tools, and I'm curious if there are any that you've been using in any of the organizations you've been part of that you've had success with. You know, kind of see some of these other, you know, ML tools like Spark or Databricks as part of the stack and augmenting these data architectures.
Yeah, so my experience is very, very biased towards Google Cloud. So like natively using, you know, the tools that are available within there. So I'm not going to, you know, go into more detail on that, but pretty much exclusively we've been, you know, leveraging tools like, you know, BigQuery for storage of data, you know, Bigtable for kind of some of the more semi-structured, unstructured data, as well as, you know, kind of, within BigQuery, there's like machine learning applications, there's cloud AI notebooks. You can kind of leverage that with Kubernetes and compute clusters, which that part I had to, work with DevOps to configure, like kind of out of my realm a little bit, and then from there, backend service and APIs connect, and that's kind of where the product team comes in and, kind of pulls in that data. So that's kind of my experience. But yeah, primarily like, cloud-based Google Stack, a little bit of, you probably, you can leverage Spark and Python like through the Cloud AI Notebook, and leverage the typical stuff that you'd see, TensorFlow and, the pre-built, algorithms that already do exist. So that's kind of my experience with them.
Okay. There's a lot of different stuff out there, especially in the ML world, and it can get a little confusing. So definitely worth investigating some options there. Ben, I think you mentioned this, and I'll direct it to you. There's a question about kind of data enrichment, and what kind of use cases are you seeing around folks augmenting data inside of Snowflake with data enrichment providers?
Yeah, it's a fun prompt to talk about. We have a data marketplace that is adding tens of new data sets every week. So it's in the hundreds now. And the one that I think has been most interesting over the last year and a half, 2 years is our COVID-19 data tracker, which was free and available in our data marketplace. That's the example that was getting the most use at that time through our marketplace. And then I think the segment that we've seen growing fastest has been time-sensitive financial data sets. Knowing that hedge funds are maybe the biggest consumer of them, they want to be able to act and trade on data sets in real time or as close as they can, and data sharing provides that opportunity instead of the old school method of having to ship it to a data provider or get it from a data provider. So I think naturally that's kind of where we're seeing the most acceleration in the finance world. But there's also these cool edge cases that are being applied to, like the COVID-19 data set.
Great. I'll resist the temptation to talk about how much Sumidev's trying to get me to buy NFTs, but that's for another day. We only have a couple minutes left. Maybe I'll just ask our panelists to kind of share any kind of closing thoughts based on the questions and discussion they've had, with interest in helping everybody be successful out there. And maybe Jamila, we'll start with you.
That was me? Sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, closing thoughts. I mean, I think it's definitely, moving towards the cloud, definitely moving towards more real time, but I would say real time, like in my opinion, is usually not real time. You're probably serving content in real time, but the scoring, the modeling, the training, that typically all happens, on a training set with historical data, typically what I've seen. And so, you may not need every component to be real time, but there's definitely a lot of use cases. And like, I want to toot RudderStack's horn a bit, but we've been leveraging RudderStack. It is a very cool tool. CDPs, just generally speaking, are very, very powerful. With the data, being able to own your own data, being able to have your own use cases. As long as you have the right team in place and you have the right analytical talent and the support structures, DevOps, et cetera, it's definitely worth kind of going down that route, because your warehouse is at the center, but you kind of need the data coming in and the data going out to be able to enable your use cases. And so that's my closing thought.
Great. Ben, any parting thoughts in our remaining moments here?
Yeah, just keep it simple. Try to keep a single source of truth, in the data platform you're using, and then, bring in a tool like RudderStack that allows you to go vertical across your SaaS apps instead of siloed data that's horizontal, confined to each app. And if you make these trade-offs, up front, you're going to be paying for way less tech debt. That's what we've seen over and over again. So if you keep it simple at the beginning, it will, by and large, stay simple, even as it gets more complex and you're doing more interesting things with the data sets. You can really avoid painful situations in the future. So keep it simple is the parting advice.
Sumdev, they teed it up for you. Take us out.
Yeah. I'll second what Ben said, right? Like, avoid data silos, keep control over your data. Like, particularly when it comes to customer data, that will pay off in many ways in the long run. Like the kind of use cases you can build, and like the kind of the business benefit of doing that. So yeah, avoid silos and centralize.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists for taking time, and to our audience for joining us. I hope you found it useful, and look forward to learning more about what you guys built.
Thanks.